Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
And Ray, what I'll do is I'll just kind of put this back in the middle between the two and then I'm back.
And anybody else want to? Oh, is that true?
Everyone ready?
Yep.
Okay. Aloha, everyone. Thanks very much for coming this morning. My name is Joshua Wish. I'm the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Hawaii. This news conference today is a joint effort between the ACLU of Hawaii and the Hawaii Disability Rights Center. I'd like to thank Lou Erdeshek, the Executive Director of the Hawaii Disability Rights Center, for hosting us today. We also have with us today two people who've really been running point on the issues we're going to be discussing. Ray Shi, who is a legal fellow with the ACLU of Hawaii, and Jane Priest, who is a staff attorney with the Hawaii Disability Rights Center. And we're here today on the first day of classes of the 2019-2020 school year to call on the Hawaii Department of Education to end its almost routine practice of subjecting public school students to long periods of out-of-school suspensions, and to call on the Hawaii Department of Education to confront and challenge the systemic institutional biases that are revealed in the data that we'll be discussing today. Put simply, the Hawaii Department of Education is suspending far too many students for periods that are far too long, especially as compared to their counterparts on the mainland. And this is being felt especially hard by local students of color and local students with disabilities. Our kids go to school to learn. They go to school to learn from teachers, from books, from things they find online, and critically from each other. And as Lou and Ray will be discussing in some detail today, this is being made increasingly difficult because Hawaii public school students are being subjected to out-of-school suspensions that are sometimes as long as almost half a year's worth of instruction and far longer than their counterparts on the continental United States. And there is a disproportionate impact in these suspensions on students of color in Hawaii and students with disabilities in Hawaii. These students are being excluded from all types of learning, and it is doing precious little to make our schools any safer. On a personal note, as someone whose wife is a proud product of Hawaii Public Schools and who has family members that are currently enrolled in Hawaii Public Schools, I know how important it is that we get this right as a community. So with that, I'm going to move off to the side, and I'm going to turn it over to Lou and to Ray.
Well, thank you. I'm really happy to host all you folks today. I want to welcome our colleagues from the ACLU as well as members of the TV and printed media, and thank you. I appreciate all of you coming. And I also do appreciate the opportunity to work with the ACLU. We are both kindred, similar kinds of entities. We're both public interest law firms dedicated to helping people, and we don't always have the opportunity to work together. So I was really, I've been looking forward to this, and this has been an interesting project to be able to work together. What we're here today probably shouldn't come as any great shock to some of you, because I think it's been reported in the press before. There is a huge over-reliance on suspensions by the Department of Education. I think the Advertiser had a lengthy article about it. We saw this in the SEAC report, the Special Education Advisory Council. They're the entity that's supposed to advise the DOE on special ed. They flagged this out as well. So the statistics are pretty alarming that kids in Hawaii with disabilities are suspended at twice the length of time as kids on the mainland, and they're also suspended at a rate 3 times higher than kids here that don't have disabilities. And so a couple of days ago, we filed a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights at the federal government. They're located in Seattle as the regional office. We filed a formal complaint, and Jane Priest really did all the work on that and really helped get everything together. And the essence of the complaint is asking them to come in and do an investigation and just say, what's going on? I mean, what's up with all these suspensions? Why are they occurring? And what can we do to change that? It's really pretty simple. We represent a lot of kids in special education. As you probably know, under the IDEA, they're entitled to receive appropriate education. And we battle with the schools a lot, quite frankly. I mean, we often find that the education that's provided to some of these kids is not what we think it ought to be. And so we represent a lot of them in these individual education plan meetings. We sometimes have to go to litigation and do these due process cases with them. But at least they're in school. When they're out of school, they're not getting anything. They may get sent home with like some homework assignments or whatever, but they're not getting the interaction with their peers, the socialization, the ability to participate in extracurricular activities. It's very isolating to a child to be suspended. And so we think it's a real problem that it's happening at twice the national average. And that's really why we want the federal government to come in and take a look at it. We contacted the DOE. We didn't just jump into this. I mean, we contacted them and basically got no response. We wanted to try to see if perhaps they had a plan in place, or have they thought about what could be done. And we got no response at all, which is probably not a big surprise. I mean, a lot of times we don't get much of a response from the DOE. So we felt that we needed to take some further action, and so we filed the complaint with the federal government. And since they didn't want to come and talk to us, we're hoping that they'll talk to the feds, and hopefully this will produce some results. And ultimately, the hope is that it's going to change some behavior. I mean, this can really be fixed pretty easily. They don't need a court order or anything else. All I've got to do is just stop this over-reliance on the use of suspensions and start educating these kids in the schools like they're supposed to. So I think if they change their behavior, as Ray and the ACLU have tried to get them to do, I think she could explain that in some greater detail, probably.
Okay, thank you, Lou. Thank you for having us be here today. The ACLU today sent out letters to 15 complex area superintendents, which is every single complex area in the state, as well as each high school principal in that complex area. And what that letter details is an over-reliance on out-of-school suspensions, particularly among kids who are of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander descent, and also amongst kids with disabilities. What we're asking the DOE to do today on the first day of school is to curb the use of out-of-school suspensions. The reason we sent it to the principals and the complex area superintendents is that it's the principals and the vice principals that make these decisions whether or not to suspend students. And it's complex area superintendents that have to approve suspensions greater than 10 days. So this doesn't require, as Lou said, a court order. It doesn't require legislation. It doesn't require any sort of budgetary funding to keep kids in school to be educated the way they're supposed to be. School is where you come to learn, where you are welcomed. And we found that suspending children actually worsens the school climate and actually leads to more behaviors that people would consider disruptive in the classroom. I'm a former high school math teacher. I understand what it is like to work with vulnerable populations. But the thing is I never ever went to my principal and asked that my students be suspended. It was always better to keep them in the classroom learning math with me rather than to put them out at home where they were unsupervised, where you didn't know what kind of educational services that they would receive. And here in Hawaii, when students are suspended, it's very spotty, we've heard, the types of educational services that they receive at home. And when you're on suspension, you're not allowed to participate in extracurricular clubs or after-school activities, which are an integral part of just learning. And so tomorrow and this week, as we start the 2019-2020 school year, principals and complex area superintendents can stop this racially disparate and disparate on the basis of disability practice today. And we're calling on them to do that. The days lost for Asian students is worse here than any other state in the country. And Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are suspended at 3 times the length of the national average days. So they lose 75 days per 100 students. And so we don't want Hawaii to be known as the worst state for students with disabilities or Asian students or Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander students in the country. We want to make sure that our children are being educated in schools. So we want to address the policies, practices, and procedures that the principals and the complex area superintendents are operating under when they're suspending children. People have come to us saying that their kids have been suspended for 92 days, which is more than half the school year, for smelling like cannabis. And that shouldn't be a reason that you're put out of school. You aren't harming others. You should be educated in classrooms on why that behavior might not be the best behavior for your future. But the answer to that is not punitive school discipline. And so today we're calling on the complex area superintendents and the principals to ensure that kids are staying in schools. Thank you. We'll take any questions if anyone has any.
You touched on one possibility for a circumstance that would lead to a suspension. Have you looked into what is prompting these long out-of-school suspensions? What do they cite as the reason?
So we've actually asked the Department of Education for data related to school suspensions disaggregated by protected class, meaning disability status, free and reduced lunch, race, national origin, gender. And the DOE has not given us the data that we've asked for, similar to the Hawaii Disability Rights Center attempt to get more information. So it's hard for us to tell based on this data, which comes from the 15-16 school year civil rights data collection, which is from the Federal Department of Education. Every single school, district, state must submit data to the CRDC, and then state is in the process of submitting data in the 17-18 data collection year. So we'd love to get information about that very question. I can guess at that question based on the intakes that we have received in the Hawaii Disability Rights Center that we has received, and a lot of it I think has to do with illicit substances. But again, I can't verify because we've asked for that data and have not received it.
This might be a question for Luke, kind of following up. Cutbacks in special ed, is that in the high amount of disabled students?
You're saying is the
Yeah.
cutback in would that account for the
Well, I mean, might that be a factor?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, I think that, as I say, I mean, as you know, I mean, we have been very critical of the quality of special education that's provided in the schools over the years. We've had lengthy litigation against the DOE in the past because they didn't comply with the IDEA requirements to educate them until 22. They kicked them out at the age of 20. It took a Ninth Circuit Court of Opinion to get them to allow these kids to stay until 22. We have a case going against them right now because they're not providing medically necessary applied behavioral analysis services to kids on the autism spectrum in the schools, and they're not even letting outside providers. So the quality of the special education that's provided has been a huge concern to us for a long period of time. So now I guess we're down to arguing about the quantity of it, and so we think that to single out kids with disabilities and suspend them for a long period of time is particularly concerning. And I don't know all the factors, obviously, about what they are. And if somebody brings drugs to school, I mean, understand, we're not necessarily coming from a perspective of trying to say that it's okay to violate the law or things like that. If drugs are illegal, I mean, then bringing them into school is not a good thing. But the law is also very clear that if a child's conduct is a manifestation of their disability, then that puts them into a slightly different footing. And so the schools are required under the law to actually do what they call a manifestation hearing to see is that why the kid did what the kid did, because the kid's got a disability. And so if that's the reason for it, then the school needs to try to accommodate that somehow. And there's supposed to be a behavior plan in place so that you could de-escalate conduct and redirect them and things of that nature. So that's the approach that should be taken. Just kicking them out of school, that's kind of like the easy way out. Let's just get this kid out of here. And the other thing that I didn't mention earlier is that you have what they call ad hoc suspensions, which are sort of like, I think of them as slightly hidden in terms of the statistics, because you have days where the principal will call up the parent and say, well, he's having a bad day, I want you to just come pick him up and take him home. that doesn't get recorded as a suspension, or would they say, just go sit in the principal's office, and so those are sort of like suspensions, but they don't even get documented and factored in the data, and the data is bad enough the way it reads right now.
I'm a little rusty on the current IDEA law, but the manifestation determination review is required for any suspension beyond 10 days and above. And while your numbers speak for themselves, maybe you don't need to go any farther than that. If these MDRs were in fact held, I kind of doubt that they could suspend special ed students in those numbers. So there's a question about whether these reviews are in fact being held. Now, any suspension, even for half a day, is a change in placement. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the school has to provide a free, appropriate public education according to the IEP, even for a half-day suspension, which must be recorded as a suspension because it's a change in placement. So, in the heyday of Felix, what the schools would do was none of these things would happen. You wouldn't get the MDRs. You wouldn't get anybody paying any attention to continuing progress in the IEP. But the next IEP, they'd say, oh, you haven't made enough progress, and they'd fix the IEP. So my question to you guys, and it may be not something that you can answer, is the DOE following the law if they're not counting a half-day suspension as a suspension, if they may not be conducting these MDRs, and last part of my question, if they're suspending special ed students for reasons that they would not suspend an ordinary student, that's also not allowed, but contributes to the numbers. The principal could get rid of the kid rather easily by not following the law.
Well, I think that's what we were suggesting, is that you have some of those suspensions that don't even get recorded as suspensions. I think the easy answer to that is that this is the kind of thing that we're hoping that the Office of Civil Rights will be able to get at when it conducts its investigation, so that they would have to ask those kinds of questions as well, and the DOE will be required to provide some answers to them.
I think you've brought up two really good points that we've seen, not just in the disabilities context. Ad hoc suspensions is actually a larger issue of proper data collection and data reporting. There are other instances where just most recently we figured out that the DOE is not adequately, up until the 17-18 school year, reporting all instances of restraint, right? So there's an issue about data collection and transparency in the DOE, as well as publicly making that information available in a way that's understandable to families and students. And the other piece that you mentioned is actually a large issue on due process. So we've heard of kids, so not just with disabilities, but kids being suspended in general, and in particular Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander descent, being suspended without being notified of their right to a hearing, an appeal for suspensions greater than 10 days. So we see that actually not just in the disability context, but I think you're sort of on the right path and thinking, is the DOE actually compliant with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and all of its protections, which are stronger than for the general student body? And I think we have some of those same concerns.
Lou, you kind of started to say something and then you corrected yourself, and it's to deal with the question of the rate of suspension, as in the rate of students who are suspended and the length of suspension. So I just thought it might be good to clarify that what you're talking about is long suspensions, because when I look at the national data, Hawaii's suspension rate is much lower than the national average. So 5.3% nationally versus 3.5%.
Yeah,
that's NCS.
No, I was getting a little confused by some of that too. I mean, my understanding is that may be the rate for all kids as opposed to just for kids with disabilities. I don't know that we have the data on the rate for kids with disabilities. So that's something I think you'd really want to look at. But yes, the issue that, because we don't have the data, we can't really claim anything, right? So the essence of the complaint is the length of the suspensions. That sure, even if you do feel it's appropriate to suspend somebody, well then fine, you could do it for a short period of time. But this huge length of suspension is what Ray was saying. I mean, these kids could end up missing half the school year like that, and that seems ridiculous.
Given the national political climate, I mean, how likely is it that the federal government will investigate your complaint? And if they don't, will that force you to file a lawsuit along these lines to force the DOE to do that?
I've interned at the Office of Civil Rights and the U.S. Department of Education, and they're actually mandated to investigate every complaint that comes through that office. So how that happens is not something under our control, but we remain confident that the Seattle Regional Office will investigate this complaint, particularly since it's against the entire school system, and that the DOE is under a consent decree or resolution agreement to identify instances of bullying on the basis of protected class, and is currently going through the rewrite of Chapter 19, Chapter 41 now on the basis of a previous federal complaint. And so as the DOE is looking forward to its 2020-2030 strategic planning process, we want to make sure that this is taken into consideration when they're thinking through their principles of equity and HA in their planning process. And so we've been at those focus group meetings. We've been encouraging the DOE to take this plus the data transparency piece into account. And so regardless of the political climate, we feel confident that this will be investigated by the Federal Department of Education. And we're still, to the second part of your question, pursuing our other options in terms of whether it's going to be legislation or litigation. But I just want to really remind everyone that the reason we wrote this letter to complex area superintendents and principals is that they can change their practice today, the first day of school, and stop suspending kids. It doesn't take any additional money to educate the children that are enrolled in your school. So we are hopeful that we can work together with the DOE on this. We don't want to be adversarial on it. We've asked for data. We sent letters to the complex area superintendent. It wasn't like a filed complaint with the court, right? So we want to be a resource for technical assistance. There are districts and jurisdictions on the mainland that have eliminated suspensions entirely, and I would love the DOE to talk to them. There are places that have capped suspension at 7 days. If you have kids being suspended for 92 days, doing the same thing as kids on the mainland who aren't being suspended at all, why are we relying on this punitive form of discipline? We don't need to do that. So we want to encourage the DOE to reach out. It doesn't have to be through us, although we're happy to, and the Hawaii Disability Rights Center is also happy to. So reach out and talk to some of these places that are reducing these suspensions, using more social emotional learning practices or sort of justice practices, trying to improve overall school climate instead of doing things like trying to punish away instances of bullying that might actually speak to other factors.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. I mean, you don't need a lawsuit to necessarily get them to do that. And having been involved in lots and lots of lawsuits over the years, you begin to realize that even when you win, that's only the beginning of everything. The implementation is a whole other process. So if you can get them to change their behavior just because it makes sense and it's the right thing to do, that's obviously the way to go. And yeah, I certainly have every reason to think that the federal office will investigate. I mean, what the outcome will be, I guess we'll have to find out. But I'm not that concerned that they would refuse to even look at it. Yeah.
Yes.
The 7-day suspension is a common technique on the mainland to avoid the 10-day suspension. Mm-hmm. And when the 7 days is up, the kid is in school for 2 days, and then there's another 7-day suspension. This is unbelievably common, and it basically is an attempt to skirt the IDEA. I don't think we want that in Hawaii either.
Mm-hmm. It's not just the IDEA. The 10 days comes from Goss v. Lopez, which is a federal Supreme Court case that guarantees your right to an education in a way that if you, a due process protection, right, where if you're suspended for greater than 10 days, you must be entitled to a hearing. We want to make sure that that situation, as you described, doesn't happen here. So part of that could be like the DOE and the Board of Education writing a regulation saying that these types of suspensions need to be tracked to see if not only how many days are you suspended for, are we suspending for 0 to 10 days, 11 to 22 days, 29 days, or however many you want to chunk it out by, but also that you are tracking the individual student in a way that you can see if they have been suspended for an aggregate more than 10 days. And there are other jurisdictions that do have that type of language in their legislation or their school policy to make that very clear and transparent. So I think it's a two-part ask, is the changing the policy and the practice to reduce the suspension down and to make sure that in aggregate you're not going above the 10 days or however we set it at, we being the state. And then the second part is that we're tracking that in a way that protects student privacy, but also makes very clear to families and students and teachers and community members how exactly we are treating students and whether that involves putting them out of school for extended periods of time.
Ray, you sort of mentioned this, suspending children worsens the school environment. What are the long-term social impacts and impacts on individuals of having a high suspension?
Great question. Part of this, and the reason that we're so concerned, is that punitive measures like out-of-school suspensions lead to the school-to-prison pipeline, and that's a common term that we hear, and what we view that as is that you're taking kids out of the educational environment and putting them into situations that increase contacts with the juvenile justice system and further on, potentially the adult criminal legal system. We really want to prevent that, and we see that, for instance, in situations where there are police on school campuses, and the police are there presumably to protect children and keep the environment safe. But we've seen over and over, not just here, but also on the mainland, that police in schools actually just leads to an over-policing and an over-criminalization of children in those schools. So you have kids as young as elementary school, 7 years old, being handcuffed and arrested for minor violations. And so that's among the data that we are tracking as well. And so when we're talking about why this matters, it's not just a child's educational right here, that they need to be able to learn in order to interact with society and be good citizens and be productive and go on and lead happy and fulfilling lives. Is that the flip side of that is that putting them out of school actually can lead to increased dropout rates, increased chance of teenage pregnancy, increased chance that you will experience incarceration as a juvenile and an adult. And I have been to both our juvenile detention facility, our youth prison, and it's not a place that you want your kids to end up in. But what we're seeing is that some of our most vulnerable children are ending up in these situations for really minor violations. And that's something that we don't want to over-police or over-criminalize or over-punish our children for sometimes making mistakes the way kids do. And so we want to make sure that every kid has a right to an education, every kid is staying in school, and that we aren't trying to promote sort of a push-out culture that leads to juvenile detention or adult incarceration.
This is a national problem. I mean, the phenomenon of the school-to-prison pipeline is happening everywhere, unfortunately. But when you have such lengthy suspensions, it creates a much greater risk for it to happen even more. But I mean, for a long time, a lot of these issues at the school may have been underdealt with, and then you have this tremendous overreaction, so that behavior that when I was a kid might have wound somebody up in the principal's office, or call their parent and come get them and talk to them. Now all of a sudden we've gone so far the other way because of the zero tolerance concept that all of a sudden that same behavior then gets you booked at HPD or sent to the juvenile court and things like that. And so what you need is some common sense and some balanced perspective in terms of how to approach these kinds of situations.
Anyone else? Thank you all for being here today.
Thanks, everyone.